On behalf of the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution, I would like to thank all of you for joining today's Juneteenth panel on racial justice in America. The IIP is a think tank dedicated to prosecution and criminal justice reform at John Jay College of Criminal Justice that promotes community-centered standards of safety, fairness, and dignity. This panel is a part of a virtual series that the IIP has been hosting since the COVID-19 pandemic shifted us to remote operations. At the conclusion of this panel, we will post the full video as well as additional resources on the panel on the remote discussions page on our website, which will be linked in the chat. Please join us for the following upcoming remote events. On Thursday, June 25th at 1 p.m., our book club discussion will focus on Tutwiler, a new Marshall Project frontline documentary film about women in an Alabama prison who support each other through pregnancy, labor, and saying goodbye to their newborns. Our partners at Arts for Society have launched a podcast on criminal justice reform and human resiliency explored through the arts that features conversations held as a part of the IIP's remote arts series. You can find these episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts. Join the IIP on June 30th for a discussion on criminal justice in the LGBT community in honor of Pride Month. More details on this panel are coming soon. And you can find information on these resources and other upcoming events on our social media pages on Instagram and Twitter at IIP_JohnJ. At the IIP, we have adopted the practice of doing a living land acknowledgement before all of our events. This is specific to New York City, but we encourage listeners to learn and acknowledge their local history wherever they may be. The IIP is based in New York City, which is Lenape-Hoking, Lenape homeland. We honor all of the indigenous nations and their land with great gratitude and acknowledge the genocide and continuous displacement of indigenous peoples. We also acknowledge the enslaved Africans whose labor built New York City during the colonial era and beyond. We acknowledge the harm inflicted upon the indigenous communities and people of color across the country, in particular the ongoing and current harms to Black communities, including those caused by law enforcement, which inspire our ongoing work. Thank you to our panelists and guests for participating in this discussion, which requires us to expose ourselves to traumatic history and events. The conversation may invoke strong reactions, and in the event that you feel the need, please take whatever time you need to stop the video or the audio, to step away from your computer, or to exit the program entirely. If you can rejoin the presentation, we'd be glad to have you, and we appreciate each of your presence to whatever extent you are able to be with us. Our conversation will go on until about 12:15, at which point we will conclude with a musical selection. We invite you to send questions throughout this panel. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to send your questions directly to the host. Today's panel honors Juneteenth, which celebrates the end of American slavery. On June 19, 1865, Union soldiers arrived at Galveston, Texas with news of the end of the Civil War and the emancipation of American slaves. Owing to a lack of Union troops to enforce the end of slavery, Texas was the last state in which previously enslaved Americans were freed, nearly 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation formally ended slavery in Confederate-held states on January 1, 1863. Freedom was then codified into the law of the land with the ratification of the 13th Amendment in December of 1865. Today, Juneteenth is observed by 47 state governments, and many across the country are campaigning to make Juneteenth a national holiday. We are pleased to be able to use this time to reflect on how far we've come and the long road ahead. And with that, I'll turn the program over to the director of the IIP, Lucy Lang.
That was Jonathan Terry, the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution's policy advisor. Thank you, Jonathan, and to the outstanding IIP staff, Shauna, Michelle, and Michael, for identifying the need for this conversation today and for your work to make it happen. Thank you, panelists, and to the audience for your willingness to join this hard conversation. I'm moved to see that we're joined by so many of our students from both inside and outside prison walls, by activists and advocates, and by leadership and line staff from public defense and prosecutors' offices across the country. In recent weeks, I have heard from so many of you who have been at the front lines of the criminal system as people charged with crimes, survivors of crimes, and as lawyers and law enforcement about what you're learning, teaching, and struggling with right now. Thank you for the discussions that you're surfacing in our institutions and in our streets. Before I introduce our panelists, knowing that no single moment can encompass or acknowledge our history, the importance of this date, or this potentially pivotal time in America, I invite you all to join me in a moment of silence. I'm honored to introduce today's panelists, starting with Karol Mason, who is the president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Previously, President Mason worked as Assistant Attorney General beside Attorney General Eric Holder under the Obama administration, where she served as the head of the Department of Justice's Office of Justice Programs, overseeing a $4 billion budget to support an array of state and local criminal justice agencies. Kim Foxx is the state's attorney for Cook County, Illinois, which includes Chicago and neighboring suburbs. She oversees the nation's second largest prosecutor's office and is responsible for lowering incarceration rates in her jurisdiction by nearly 20% in her first term. James Forman is a distinguished professor at Yale Law School, where he teaches on criminal and constitutional law. He is also the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Locking Up Our Own: Crime and Punishment in Black America. And Johnny Perez is the director of the U.S. Prison Program for the National Religious Campaign Against Torture and a member of the New York Advisory Committee to the United States Civil Rights Commission. Mr. Perez advocates for the end of inhumane prison practices like solitary confinement. I want to start with a professor to give us some historical perspective here. Professor Foreman, we are in a moment of historic criminal justice reform. Can you give us briefly a broad history of the reform movement and speak to how our current moment fits into that history?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I do want to honor Juneteenth, and I do want to say that I think there's two things about slavery that I just want to put out there. One, for all the audience to reflect on, is that we had slavery in this country for longer than we haven't. So 1619 to 1865 is more years than 1865 to the present. So I'm not even talking about Jim Crow, I'm just talking about slavery. And so when we think about slavery, understand that it's an institution that dominates our country and our institution and our thinking still to this day. The other thing that I just want to say about slavery is that one of the many, many horrors of it is the way in which it deprived Black people of our histories. So when I look at pictures, we all on this call, we have ancestors who were slaves, but many of us, at least for myself, I can't identify the actual individuals because the histories were erased from the book. So I just want to say that when I look at pictures of former slaves gathering to celebrate emancipation or otherwise, I think that that could be my ancestors in that picture. And even though I don't know who they are, I honor them and I respect their struggle. In terms of your question, and I think I probably have about 30 seconds now to give the broad history, but let me just say, I think there's two things that are happening. One is that the struggle for equality and fairness in our legal system, in our justice system, has been part of the Black freedom struggle for as long as there have been Black people in this country. So what we're seeing today has roots in previous generations of struggle for justice and struggle for equality. So that's some of the long history. And then the immediate history is that over the last few years, we've seen a movement build up, Black Lives Matter, and other manifestations of that movement that have raised this issue to a level of consciousness that I will say I have never seen in my lifetime. I have never seen the amount of energy and amount of activism and amount of determination to make real lasting change than I have seen in the last few weeks. And that is something that gives me hope on this day, Juneteenth.
President Mason, in your work, instrumental work really, as part of the Obama administration's pushes for criminal justice reform, can you tell us a bit about the principles that guided the reform efforts then at the federal level and some reflections on the past few years in criminal justice reform nationally? I'm going to remind you to unmute yourself, please, boss.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to do something meaningful on Juneteenth to honor the spirit of why Juneteenth is important. And so 2 minutes. I have to start with, for me in my role as at OJP, this work really began to take form when I got a letter from the then president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice, Tracy Mears and Tom Tyler, Phil Goff, and many others, challenging me and saying, this is the role the Justice Department ought to be playing a role in this post-Trayvon Martin conversation. Because remember, this was all before Michael Brown ever happened. So they sent me a 5 or 6 page letter. I brought together a group across the Department of Justice to hear them and have the conversation. And then we went radio silent with those folks, because then the department came together and started thinking about their right. What should we be doing as the Justice Department to address these issues, these systemic issues happening across the country? And so for my part, what I wanted to do at the Office of Justice Programs is to use the little bit of money I had, and I had to beg, borrow, and twist arms to cobble together enough money to create something that became the National Institute for Building Community Trust and Justice. And when we first put out the solicitation, I cobbled together a little less than $5 million to bring together the principles of procedural justice, racial reconciliation, and implicit bias, using the research that was out there to figure out how do we use this to strengthen the relationships between communities, particularly communities of color, and law enforcement, and the whole system. So we had to start somewhere. We only had $5 million. We started with law enforcement because that's what most people think of when they see the criminal justice system, because most people have interaction with police. Most don't have an interaction with prosecutors, defense counsel, or the judges. So we thought we'd start there, but had hoped to build it up. So for me, this moment is really painful, because we announced this initiative right after Michael Brown, and hope to use this research to make sure that a Michael Brown situation never happened again. And Minneapolis was one of our pilot sites. So we had spent years working with the Minneapolis Police Department and the community to make sure this never happened. And what happened was worse than we could have ever imagined. And so what I think that means for us in this context, as James said, I am heartened by the fact that our young folks are no longer willing to wait for change. As President Obama said in My Brother's Keeper town hall a couple of weeks ago, our young folks grew up believing what we say, that we have a society that's supposed to be just and fair, and they're demanding it. So I am heartened now that they are pushing us and making sure that we do this hard work to make sure that our systems change. And I'm grateful that we're seeing laws change every day. What's happened in New York, what happened in Kentucky, banning no more no-knock warrants, everybody banning chokeholds, but these are just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more we need to do. And prosecutors play a critical role in that. We didn't have the funding when I was there to do this. So when the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution was launched, right before our administration was ending in October of 2016, I thought, okay, we're gonna do this. That next day after the launch of the IIP at the White House, we had a meeting with judges talking about these issues. So I'm thinking, good, we now have everybody's attention, and everybody's realizing that to have systemic change, we've all got to be part of this conversation. And so I'm glad of the richness of this panel that you've pulled together to talk about these issues.
We're so grateful at the IIP to have the opportunity to bring together prosecutors and community voices to really think critically about the legacy of prosecution in the country. State's Attorney Foxx, you have been a real national leader on all kinds of criminal justice reform through the prosecutor's office. But today, as we're seeing an increasing amount of discussion around reparations, restoration, acknowledgement, I want to ask you a bit about how in the past you've recognized your office's responsibility to address the history of racial oppression in the country and specifically in Chicago. What does it mean for a prosecutor's office to acknowledge that history? And how has your understanding of your role evolved in the years that you've been in office?
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you, IIP, for allowing me to be a part of such an esteemed panel on such I think, a joyous day. The fact that Juneteenth has gotten so much support and attention in the wider community, for those of us in the African American community who have known and understood the historic nature of this day, to have it finally into the mainstream conversation, to have deeper conversations about the history of slavery in America and its vestiges through the years. I think that's what I'm most excited about this day being, is that we are having conversations that are long overdue. And one of those conversations is about the role of prosecutors and in the criminal justice system, carrying on some of the same atrocities, if you will, of racism that came from slavery, using the arm of the law, using the arm of the state to promote policies that had led to the incarceration, the over-incarceration of the Black community. Realizing that as slavery ended, that there were different perversions and manifestations of controls of community that were baked into the criminal justice system and the criminal legal system. And knowing, having been a line assistant, a line prosecutor, that a lot of what that looked like wasn't what I thought I was doing, was not what I was going into this work to do. You know, I went into this work having been a survivor of sexual abuse, sexual assault, having known people who've been the survivors of violent crime, coming from a neighborhood that had been impacted by violence, wanting to be a champion of people who have been hurt and wanting to have a system that was fair. And then getting into it and seeing sort of the heartbreak of the work of, I was spending a lot of my time and resources not dealing with issues that got me there. It was seeing people going to jail because they had drug addiction issues or because they had mental health issues, or seeing people get sentences that were seemed far longer than what the harm that was caused. And it started me to think about, what is this? How do we get here? And then to do the necessary work, to look at the history of how the justice system was set up and how those things are systemic, and what is the role that I play in that. And I think it's really important that we own that. I think in the larger conversation around systemic racism, people and institutions will point to other institutions about where the problem is. And it does not absolve you of your role. You know, I think people would love to stop the conversation at policing, but policing and prosecution go hand in hand. You know, police bring the cases to prosecutors. Prosecutors have a tremendous amount of discretion in what we choose to prosecute or not prosecute, how we use our resources. And so it was very important for me to learn that history and then to say we have to own it. Because when we talk about the fundamental breakdown of trust between law enforcement and communities of color, particularly the Black community, we are a part of that. And that broken relationship, you know, the onus has always been on, we should meet each other halfway. And it's like, no, I don't know that you meet the people, ask them to come to you when you've caused the harm. And so I think framing the conversation of, let's own our role here. It doesn't mean that when you've come into the work that you came in here with an explicit intention to be racist. It doesn't mean that you've come into this work trying to do harm. If we are truly ministers of justice, if our goal is to be repairers of harm, we should not be steeped in policies that do more harm than good. And so I think it is required, in order for us to reach that mandate, to own how we got here, own our responsibility in it, because that informs how we fix it. It informs the level of intentionality and purpose that we have to put into it to make the system better, to make it, I think I shouldn't even say better, because it is fundamentally broken, to transform it. But you can't get there. You cannot get there if you do not own your role and responsibility to getting us where we are right now.
I so appreciate that you brought up what we talk about as the silos of the criminal justice system and how easy it makes it for folks to point at another system actor as being the core of the problem. And in my longtime experience as a prosecutor, much of that ended up getting pointed to corrections, that prosecutors would say, well, I'm just doing my job. The legislature established these sentences, and then I'm handing folks off to corrections, and what happens there isn't on my hands. And I'm so thrilled that Mr. Perez is here with us today, because that is precisely what you are working to shine a light on and solve. So in your work on inhumane practices in US prisons that are often the vestiges of previous eras of our history, how has white supremacy shaped or continue to shape the practices that you fight to end? Reminder to unmute yourself.
Nice, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for including me into this conversation, and like really honored to share space, at least virtual space, with all of you. You know, when I think about prisons, you know, I think about prisons sort of like in the middle of the movie, in a sense, you know. And by the time a person gets to prison, you know, there are so many other things that have already happened in order for this person to be there. You know, and then I have to pull the veil back a little bit and think about, you know, how, like, for example, the institution of policing, you know, and how that was predominantly like created to, you know, originally as like slave catchers and to kind of keep the social order, if you will, you know, and how that in itself, of course, you know, allowing folks in, and then how that extends. But specific to solitary confinement, you know, a practice that started early 1800s, you know, by the Quakers, you know, under this guise and idea that if you spend enough time by yourself, you will repent your sins. And the religious component is very important, because there's been, you know, you look through history, and I'm not the historian here, but, you know, there's an argument to be made how Christianity and religion has been used to not only empower people to do harm, but to also to kind of like justify that harm, if you will. So in these early days, we saw that the only thing you can keep inside of your cell was actually a Bible, and not just any religious book, but specifically a Bible. And the first prison that was actually built specifically for solitary confinement, Eastern State Penitentiary, and shout out to them, they're doing such great work, and a place that was created to harm is actually now a place of healing, if you will. But this idea that if you spend enough time alone, you'll repent for your sins, right? Already being there, you know, being picked off the street for either vagrancy and other laws that were literally created to control Black and brown bodies. You know, and then what the court found in 1890 was that the Supreme Court found that, hey, we're actually mentally harming people, and we should not have solitary confinement. And we saw a huge decrease in solitary confinement for a number of years after that. And then fast forward, you know, to the 1990s, where the huge prison boom of supermaxes, where people spend 23 hours a day, but more like 24 hours a day in practice, have sprung up. And today we have about 30 states actually that have supermax prisons where folks are locked in 23 to 24 hours a day. Now, where white supremacy plays a part is a number of different ways. You know, understanding that white supremacy is meant to terrorize people, is meant to, again, control Black and brown bodies, and you see this hyperized inside of this correctional system. So we see people who are Black and brown overrepresented inside of solitary, even over policed in a sense inside of prisons, where you have a higher likelihood of not only landing in solitary, but all the other ramifications of that. You know, I've had correction officers literally, you know, tell me to my face, hey, I can kill you in here and nothing would happen. But the piece that really sticks out for me during my 13 years of incarceration is how many correction officers that I met who were white, who had never come in contact with a person of color until it was in a correctional setting. And it made me think about what kind of messages you received about me, you know, that were not from me, and how does that shape your behavior. That, along with this idea around, you know, dangerousness or being seen as more dangerous, people of color is just seen more dangerous. Even correctional officers, been studies done actually that correctional officers see prisoners of color as being more dangerous and are more susceptible to putting the punishment. But I know the time is short, but I'll say, you know, when we understand that solitary and incarceration is fruit from a poisonous tree, and that tree being white supremacy or the mass oppression of Black and brown people, then we can understand a lot of these policies and how they fall into place. And the idea that we can, like, even for me, like, I'm an abolitionist, and I know that we can eliminate solitary tomorrow, and we'll still have, all the racial disparities and all these other pieces. So it's not just one piece that needs to change, because we can change one piece and the entire puzzle still looks the same. But the changing of all the other pieces collectively is what really will get us to a place that is uniquely and quite different than what we see today.
I want to follow up with you, Mr. Perez, about the idea of ending solitary tomorrow. And I think it's so important to note that we are talking about this in the midst of a pandemic at a time when Americans are experiencing isolation at levels that perhaps many people haven't before. Do you think that in any way is galvanizing or informing the movement in opposition to solitary confinement? And are you hopeful about that movement going forward?
As far as the idea of people being able to identify with what it feels like to be isolated, I tell you, there's been times when I've had to like show the extreme of what isolation looks like, and how right now, even today, right, like people lose track of what their days are, especially early when we were sheltered in place, lose track of the days or longing for that physical and human interaction. I have friends who were sheltered in place alone, and I had to literally check in on them. They were like losing, their patience and really frustrated and able to identify. But I think part of me is hopeful and part of me is not hopeful because of COVID-19. We've also seen huge increases in solitary, right? Pre-COVID, we saw 68,000 people who were locked in solitary. Right now, in fact, we recently released a report, the Unlock the Box report was released in 2 days ago, where we mentioned there was an increase of 500% use of solitary confinement. Folks don't know that a lot of people are released directly from solitary into society. So on one hand, I like the idea that, wow, we know what it feels like to be isolated while we're locked in our homes with internet access, and all of the other amenities that life still allows, right? We don't do solitary the service that highlight that it really does by comparing it to but it does give us some insight as to a slight sliver of what it would feel like. I always tell people, if you can go shelter in place in your bathroom for the next 30 days, and then we can start talking about, some feelings there. But history has shown me that empathy and having folks feel sorry in some senses don't necessarily make the kind of changes that we need to. Because what we get is, oh wow, that really needs to happen, a change, but no actual change like happens after that. So we've seen pluses, but we've seen a whole lot more negatives where my job has exponentially increased because now there's so many people, 300,000 exactly locked in solitary.
Thank you so much for that. Professor Forman, I want to go back to something the state's attorney raised about the police. And there's so much national attention, of course, on officer-involved fatalities and the calls to defund the police, calls to defund prosecutors' offices and other agencies. What promise do you see around this notion of defunding, and how do you see the sort of spectrum of solutions that advocates and others are calling for when they talk about defunding police or defunding prosecutors' offices?
Yeah, I think to enter into that conversation, we have to really start by understanding some of the frustration that leads up to it. There's, my dad in the 1950s, as a Black graduate student in Los Angeles, was taken by the police because he fit a description. He asked them to just go speak to the librarian inside because he had just come out of the library. They refused to do that. They took him downtown. They beat him. They interrogated him. They released him 48 hours later. And he was traumatized by that his entire life. And then when I was in law school when Rodney King was beaten to an inch of his life. And then the officers there were acquitted. And then we see everything that happens today. Now, those are my stories, but what I want to tell you is that every single Black person has those stories in their family and in their community. And so what has happened is the young people today are saying, I know that history. I've read about that history. That history is in my family. And I also know that y'all have been trying to fix it with various different reforms forever. In my book, I write about bringing Black police officers into the force, which was an idea about how to make a difference. There was community policing. There's implicit bias training. There's body cameras. There's restorative justice, procedural justice. And it's not that those aren't good ideas. Some of them are excellent ideas, but police departments have proven so resistant to any kind of change, including excellent ideas. And they keep doing some of the same things. So young people today are saying, look, however good the idea is, they're not gonna change their behavior. So the only solution we have left is to shrink their footprint. That's where defund comes from in my mind. I don't use the term defund myself because I think defund focuses on what we're taking away. And I think the real work is what are we gonna build in place? And of course, a lot of defund activists agree with that. They're also focused on what do we build in place. So I like to think of the term, you hear people talking about reimagining. And so in my mind, that's really the question is, okay, if we're gonna take functions away from police departments, what are we gonna be doing instead? And how do we build up those alternatives for provision of mental health services, for provision of drug treatment services, how to make our schools safe? Right? How do we deal with somebody who's fallen asleep in a parking lot of a Wendy's and not send somebody armed with a gun to respond to that? So that to me is what's exciting about this moment, is that there's a kind of a ferment and a fervor around radically broadening our imaginations about what it would take and what are the institutions and the programs and the policies and the government structures and the local community-based, neighborhood-based structures that we would need to help our communities heal and to make them be safe. That's what's exciting to me. But what my only caution that I'll put out there is that building up these alternatives is going to be hard. This work is not for the faint of heart. It is one thing to say we should have mental health and drug treatment and community-based services and alternative and restorative justice, right? I run an alternative school for kids from the juvenile justice system. We've been in business for 20 years. So I know on the ground how hard it is to make those alternatives excellent. And that to me is, that's the burden on us now, is to build up as a community and to fund adequately through government and philanthropy excellent alternative programs and government agencies that will actually provide community safety without all of the toxic and brutal harms of over-policing and mass incarceration. That, I think, is going to be our challenge of the next decade.
Lucy, can I add something on that?
Please do.
So I think, to James's point, it is hard. And so the question on all of us is, are we willing to make that investment, which may mean higher taxes? I mean, because we got to pay for the things we want to see happen. I think everybody's looking at this as a zero-sum game now, that we have limited money and how we're going to allocate the limited money, instead of thinking about, let's talk about what do we really want to pay for on the front end, what investments we want to make on the front end that may appear to cost more on the front end, but on the back end, they're so much more productive. Because if we invest in our young people, invest in creating opportunities, invest in education, invest in healthcare, invest in job creation, then in the long run, it's going to be hard and take a while, but then it's worth the investment. And so I like your terminology about thinking about, in church, they always talk about, you can tell a lot about your priorities by looking at your checkbook. That's what we've got to do, is look at our priorities by how we're spending and what we're willing to pay for.
It's almost like you ran a federal budget or something, President. State's Attorney, I saw you had a thought.
Yeah, I just wanted to dovetail off what the professor said as well. I think he's right. This newer generation of advocates and activists over the last several years have said this hasn't worked, right? This thing that you keep trying to reform it's not working. You're doing small tweaks. What is fascinating to me, there is this generational work though that needs to be done for an older generation who has believed that things are better, right? When we talk about the history that got us here, and it's clearly better, right? It's better than where we were, but still really there's real work around having to disabuse the notion around policing and criminality that this is the only response. I will tell you, I mentioned this because we, you know, in the wake of the uprisings of the last several weeks, you know, Chicago, much like New York and other cities across the country, we're seeing, you know, the peaceful protests, and then in the evenings it, you know, devolved into issues where people were going into buildings and things were being burned. And I was on a call with some elected leaders who were asking for more police, asking for the National Guard, asking for a presence. And these were, which is why I said, oh, please get Professor Forman on the call, on this call, because these were Black elected leaders. These were people who were, you know, representing communities that had been largely impacted by the existing policing structures, where that trust had been completely frayed. And yet in this moment of crisis, in this moment of angst and fear about what we were seeing around us, the first response was, we need more. And that, like, the pushback of having this conversation of, well, wait a minute, this is how we got here. The response can't also be this. And, you know, I thought it'd be Professor Foreman, because it was, well, we just want this for a moment, until this quells, until this stops. And I think we have to, in these conversations, as we talk about this, recognize that there is a bit of a generational divide. There is this sense of, even in our own communities that have been impacted, that policing is still, it's hard to reimagine, because in the absence of the other, it is this fear of lawlessness, right? And I think people will give you, yes, we need to invest in mental health and drug treatment and trauma. There will be a universal agreement to that until a building is on fire, and then they say no. And I think that's the work that we have to really lean into to carry out this moment that we're in, the optimism, and I think universal agreement that what we have isn't working, but also not losing that there are those among us who still, when faced in this moment, that reimagination is hard. And the reflexive response of more policing is still there. I think I was having that conversation, and it really was one that was familiar because I read your book. And also, I don't want to say frustrating, because I understood their frustration. I understood in that moment, what do we do here? But the absence of the other made it just easy to lull into past practices, which is where, if this momentum is going to continue, we have to really engage across generations of what that reimagination looks like.
Yeah, I'd like to add a quick tidbit. You know, I think there's, and I appreciate that, those responses, because it talks to culture change, right? And how do we not, you know, look to law enforcement as a knee-jerk response to every single social ill? I've had, you know, when I worked at the Urban Justice Center as their safe reentry advocate, I worked with people who have mental health concerns and also had histories of incarceration. And I often meant that I would go with them to court and, you know, try to help them however I can. And, you know, I remember one client who was arrested in the winter, arrested in the summer, released in the winter, you know, no clothes, like he still has his summer clothes on, no medication, you know, no place to go. And he stole a coat, he stole a jacket. And if I was him, I probably would have stolen a jacket too to stay warm, but he got arrested as a result. In court, it was never brought up like he was, oh, this person's a, you know, a criminal and we should arrest him. He just got out of Rikers Island, let's put him in jail. You know, but no one asked a bigger question about why was this person being released without a coat. You know, when people are arrested for stealing food and things like that, and you know, those kind of, I would say, crimes of survival. And not to make a dichotomy, but you know, there is something said to say, well, this is the act, but let's pull back and understand why this happened, and that deepens our understanding about what the solution is. Because then we see, okay, incarceration is not a solution, or in this case, policing is not necessarily the solution. Then the second piece, I think that I would respectfully disagree slightly in the sense that I don't think there is an absence of like, what's the alternative? I think that it's already there, and we have to find ways, you know, like President makes it sound like put our money where our mouth is, but to also amplify and resource those existing programs that are underfunded, understaffed, you know, and you know, have folks that are literally out here just working on a shoestring budget to provide services. When I was a kid breaking the law, you know, the old Black woman in the window had more influence over me than any police officer. And when she said, I'm going to tell your mother that you out here running crazy, that like had more of an impact on me than police officers, because my interaction with police officers was also punitive, was always punitive. You know, I don't think that I remember a positive interaction with a police officer during my teenage years. So eventually when I got arrested for gun possession at 16 years old, the world is like, wow, this 16-year-old is carrying a gun. Why is he carrying a gun? No one ever heard the 16-year-old say, well, that's because I live in a neighborhood where I failing to protect myself and I can't call the cops. So this is why I have a gun. You know, and who better to talk? You know, I think about the gun interruption work, and with this one, you know, there's been people who have talked people out of shooting people who have shot people themselves. And what that means that if I have a gun and I'm ready to harm someone, chances are the person that I'm going to listen to is actually not an officer and someone who has been through my shared experience that can talk me down, if you will. You know, and there are people out there who are actually doing this work, but are under-resourced, underfunded. The community respects them because of their journey and influence in the community. And there are times when we don't feel, I don't know, like it feels like we've been programmed, to your point, to not rely on these individuals and to call policing and things like that. And that added to the fact that police have been weaponized. We saw Amy Cooper and the weaponization of police officers and how we now use police officers because we know what the ramifications are, and weaponizing the police officers to intentionally cause harm on folks. I mean, that's probably a whole nother question, but yeah, it's a culture change piece. We have to change culture in addition to funding the revolution, whatever that looks like.
There's so much in there that I want to explore, and it goes to some questions that are coming in from our listeners. One of them is that part of police training is to treat every situation like someone might have a firearm. So how do we compare our police system to other countries when no country has the prevalence of easily attainable legal and illegal firearms? Professor, do you have any thoughts on that issue?
Oh, I thought you were going to go to State's Attorney Foxx on that one, but I'll just say yes. I think this is it is a huge issue that doesn't get enough attention, which is to say the connection between, when we know about the connection between gun ownership in this country and violence generally. But specifically, I think the question you're getting that is coming to you is, well, what's the connection between gun ownership and police violence, right? Because one of the reasons why, certainly not the only one, but one reason why police are trained the way they're trained is because of the actual prevalence of guns in communities. And I think that is a deep and profound issue. We're not going to, I'm an optimistic, hopeful person, but I don't see us getting to a point where we radically and drastically reduce the prevalence of guns that we have in this country very quickly. And so I do think we are going to have to come up with alternative approaches to police training and police use of force and accountability for police excessive force that even take into account a country that is as awash in guns as this country is. So we can't use the fact that we have so many guns as an excuse or justification for not changing police conduct.
And on that point, I want to come back to Mr. Perez's comments about culture change. And one question from the audience is, how do we implement things that don't change with the winds and administrations like budgets? How do we do something that is sort of inscribed in stone? And so is culture change a part of that? What does that look like? And I think that goes to another question from one of our brilliant partners at the Center for Court Innovation, who asks, our systems never model the accountability that they expect from and project onto our fellow citizens. How do you understand that problem? And what do you recommend? President Mason or State's Attorney Foxx?
I was too busy typing something that I wanted to make sure we didn't forget in the conversation, and that was de-escalation training. But culture change is hard. You know, at least from what I understand from the news, that's all I know, the officer in Atlanta had just finished de-escalation training. You know, and to Professor Forman's comment, you know, we need to make sure that police are equipped to have reactions other than shooting, but how do we make it stick and how do we make it work? And culture change within any institution is hard. And as I mentioned, we spent 4 years working in the Minneapolis Police Department and still had, you know, George Floyd happen. I don't have the answers. I think the only answer I have is we don't give up, that we have to keep pushing and keep working. And I think accountability is a strong piece, so that we've got an expert on the call, Prosecutor Foxx, who will answer that. But I think that we've got to give people some understanding that if you violate norms, and we've got to redefine what the norms are for policing, you're going to be held accountable, because that officer had his hand in his pocket, knowing he was being filmed. That's the thing that's really challenging, is people know they're being recorded, and the behavior is still happening. And so I don't have an answer.
Yeah, I think culture change is, it's two small words, it's huge. I think the accountability piece absolutely matters. I mean, you change culture in organizations by what you incentivize and what you penalize, right? People will accommodate the behavior to what is expected, what is rewarded, and they will change behavior based on, you know, what is penalized. And I think, again, what we have to also understand is that, again, we should award police officers, prosecutors, whomever, who see people who are acting poorly, who report that, right? We talk a lot about, you know, codes of silence, but I've also seen where there have been people who have been whistleblowers, who've come forward, who have just gotten demolished, and there's been no support around them. And people see that. And so, again, you are incentivizing silence when people who do step up and do the right thing are not supported. I think the other piece of it is around accountability. Some of the struggles as a prosecutor around accountability is that there have been so many layers of protection that have been baked into the laws over the years to allow some of this behavior, that someone would feel confident putting their hand in their pocket and doing whatever, not because the individual prosecutor won't do it, but because the laws are such that, you know, police are held to such a standard that being able to prove, I mean, Floyd's case, George Floyd's case, was so egregious because you could see that he wasn't resisting. You could see that he wasn't a threat to his personhood. But if the standard is, I feared for my safety, in such an elusive standard, and the credence that we give to that in the absence of a video, in the absence of something to be able to see, that makes it almost impossible to get convictions in these types of cases, that we then just say, instead of changing what that standard should look like, let's invest in de-escalation. Let's invest in implicit bias training. We should do all of those things too, but also recognize the standard is off. And I think that's what we need to do in changing the culture, is say that this hasn't been working, that this has been perverted, that we have the label of dangerousness that has been assigned to Black men, Black women, is different. There have been studies that have been shown, you know, around little girls, little Black girls being seen, you know, very differently at ages 9 and 10. And then your response to that is different. And so that's not like, let's take an implicit bias training. Let's assume it's already baked in. But if you then get to use deadly force out of some arbitrary, like, oh, I was afraid of this person, that's not based on real, that person wasn't actually a threat, but that makes it difficult for me to hold you accountable, we're always going to butt into that. And so I think the way that you change this on a more permanent basis is that you have to do the hard work of looking at what are the laws that are on the books that allow for the use of excessive force. Who's designed those? Are they working? Have they had a disproportionate impact? I mean, I think the point that was made earlier around, you know, guns and people, you know, would that change some of it? Yes, but you also have to look and see, there have been a number of studies that have found, again, the disproportionate number of Blacks who are killed and shot by police, and whites carry guns at the same rate, and in some places higher. You have open carry states where you don't see the same disproportionality with Blacks being killed as whites. And so it's not enough that it's just people, well, if we all didn't have guns, there are a lot of people who have guns, who marched on, the Michigan steps of the State House with these large firearms, who don't get shot. And then you have someone with the taser who does. So it's not, I want to make sure that we're careful that it's not just the prevalence of weapons in America that we've seen this, it's the prevalence of Black people without weaponry who are getting killed that should be of concern, and not allow for that to be an excuse as to why people are pulling guns, because they're not doing it in the same ways that the numbers should bear that out.
Thinking about Professor.
Oh, I was just going to ask, I was wanted to ask a question on this just for Ms. Foxx, which is that you were talking about, when you were talking about what we reward and what we punish, and you're talking about accountability, and you were talking about the laws around, criminal prosecution for excessive force or police violence that's unjustified. I was wondering, what you would think about this other question, which is job accountability. So not criminal prosecution, but whether you keep your job or not, and the role that you see union contracts playing in that. Because I remember watching from Chicago after those police officers in Congressman Rush's office were, just lounging and making popcorn and I saw your mayor and police chief, and they were both giving public statements, and the anguish in their voice as they described the pain of watching these officers just refuse to perform and debase this congressman's space. But the way they were talking to the public, it also reminded me then of how little power they must feel that they have directly of their people they are nominally supervising. Right? Because in most jobs, if the head of if everyone just starts wilding out, you don't give a press conference, you fire the people, and then maybe you issue a statement explaining why you fired them. And as I understand it, in Chicago and virtually every city in America, one of the fundamental issues is that there are contracts, collective bargaining agreements that make it either difficult to impossible to discipline and certainly to fire people. And as I further understand it, that is a matter of local policy. That is to say, those are negotiated typically by mayors or by city councils or by county councils and the relevant police force. So that is an area that if citizens care about, it's something that people, if they start demanding and asking questions and mobilizing, something that we could make a difference on. But I guess I was just wondering, do you feel like I have the diagnosis wrong? Is there something that I'm missing in the story that I just told that from your experience needs to be added to the conversation?
No, you got it exactly right. I mean, I think, again, accountability. There have been things that have been baked into these contracts. And I will say part of my optimism in this moment and that we are in history is that, the relationship between myself and the police union here has, I don't even know, I was trying to say, what's the euphemism I could say? It's been awful from the beginning. When I first came in, I came in the wake of Laquan McDonald and the conversation around policing and police accountability, Black Lives Matter was really like taking hold. And because I believed in those issues around accountability, I was immediately labeled as anti-police. Like the rhetoric around policing and how we talk about policing pitted me to the other side. And I've always said, listen, you have to hold police, plumbers, priests, everyone account for their actions. But it was immediately any conversation around police accountability, the narrative became from the union leadership that you were anti-police. And so I think what we've seen over history, when these contracts have been negotiated over time and protections that were starting to be layered in, there was a political unwillingness to say no, to go against the police. And I think we have to own that as part of that conversation, that there were a lot of things that were negotiated. Now, it should be clear, police unions didn't write these contracts themselves. Police unions didn't say, this is how we're going to be. They were negotiated. They were voted on by elected bodies. And then we saw what happened. We saw we can't fire someone that literally in Chicago, it may take years to fire someone from an infraction. When we talk in the justice system about, justice being swift and certain, where it's not certain is when you have a police officer that you cannot let go of because of all of these provisions. What I am optimistic about is now that the public is saying, what does that look like? And the momentum has shifted, and not in an anti-police way, but in the what are we incentivizing way? How do we hold people accountable? And if we are all part of it, like, again, I think we absolve so many people by saying, oh, that's just the way the system is. No, we vote on these contracts. We vote on these, your county or city official, your mayor, your alder person, they vote on these contracts. And I think not being afraid to get in a conversation with law enforcement, and again, I'll include prosecutors in it, about how do you do your role and how are we going to hold you to account? I don't think we should just leave it to elected leaders. I think the public, and why I'm optimistic, is I'm seeing public opinion shift, where 3.5 years ago when I first ran, it was radical to talk about systemic racism. It was radical to say the system. And, my governor was standing saying Black Lives Matter, a week ago. And everyone is using the terminology around systemic racism. Everyone is talking about these contracts. Now, I think collectively, the public has to demand more, because you now know. You cannot, you know too much. You know too much to not be able to say these contracts have to reflect our values. These budgets have to reflect our values. These standards have to reflect our values, and not the special interests who get to be in the room where it happens. You all get to be in the room where it happens.
And can I add another reason why I'm hopeful about this conversation? Everything they've said, absolutely agree with. And, at John Jay, because we are educating so many folks going into law enforcement, we had some concrete recommendations coming from our Black Student Union that said, these are the classes everybody at John Jay ought to have. Understanding a history of racism, understanding, all these things. And they were very specific about what the classes are. And we're going to figure out how to get that done. Because I think that what we have as a moment of, at least at John Jay, is young people who are going to go into law enforcement, those who are protesting against them, all learning beside each other, together with each other. And I want to seize this moment so that the officers we are putting out from John Jay will stand up and say, no, I don't care what the law is. That's not right. That's morally wrong. And give them a different set of tools about how they operate when they encounter these kind of situations, so that you begin to change the culture from within as well, because of who you have coming into the ranks of policing and what kind of foundation and training. John Jay was created in the 60s in a moment just like this, where somebody had the foresight to think that that our law enforcement officers ought to have training in anthropology, sociology, all these things to understand the communities they are going to serve, because that's the operative word. We give them the power. They're there to serve us, to help us have safe communities. And so part of reimagining what policing stands for is getting back to why we really have policing and what your role is, and then equipping them to do that role with honor and distinction. And we have to do all of the above, I think, to really make this stick.
I think that's exactly right, President Mason. And it makes me think about how really since the 60s in pre-progressive prosecution, but in the sort of forward-thinking prosecution world, the mandate was thought of as we're ministers of justice and we adhere to the twin pillars of safety and equity. And increasingly, the public is starting to develop an awareness around this idea, I think largely thanks to Ibram Kendi, of anti-racism. So what would it mean to be an anti-racist prosecutor's office? What does it mean to be training anti-racist police officers? Any of the panelists?
I'll take a stab at that. Get the juices flowing here. I want to say that we have to also understand that police officers are going to get a whole nother training when they're actually on the job. And there's a training that happens in college, there's a training that happens at the academy, and then there's a whole nother training that happens right in that squad car that we don't get to see. And that on the job culture has more of an impact than our institutions of higher learning. There are things that we can do. You know, when we were working in the United States Civil Rights Commission, you know, we found that like there was an overrepresentation of people of color within police manuals. So of course, when you see me, you think I'm breaking the law because you've already been trained in that respect. But then there were other, really disheartening testimony. And one that sticks out was this police officer that worked inside of the schools, which I would argue police officers don't have a place in schools, but he handcuffed a 9-year-old to the wall, and he had to use the handcuff around this person's bicep because the kid's wrists were too small. You know, like that's not training. That's you as an individual making that decision and thinking that, hey, this is okay. And of course, the reason we don't have a lot of accountability is because there's also a huge lack of transparency. A lot of these groups are asking for, you know, records of police officers on the job. And now we see their records come out a lot of times after something has happened or after they've been filmed. But I always think about, what if George Floyd wasn't filmed? You know, would we be having this conversation? You know, what if Amy Cooper didn't get, you know, videotaped? You know, and why do we need video evidence to make true what folks have been saying all along? You know, and more importantly, why is it we didn't believe them or act like we didn't believe them before? So you know, I think in terms of being anti-racist, right, is to use your role to consciously, deliberately either abolish policies that I have already proven to feed the disproportionality within the system and feed white supremacy, or at the very least, yeah, not allow it to go on, and at the very least stop it while you say it. And I'll tell you, and I'll say this, because I also went to school with friends who became police officers, and I've been talking to them privately, like, hey, how are you doing? And you know, a good friend of mine, she went off to become a police officer. She's actually an acting police officer now. And you know, I work to try to put her out of a job. I hate to say it like that. But it's a conversation that we have, which is really open. And you know, she talks to me about how, you know, she tries to call out some of his behavior inside the locker room and things like that, and literally shut down. And no, this is the way that we like do things here. You know, I've seen correctional officers fight each other in the parking lot because of this is the way that we do things here. So, you know, again, like when I think about being anti-racist, it's more than just, hey, I'm not going to prosecute this person because this seems like it has a racist tone or whatever the case may be. But it means to also doing things like this, you know, having these conversations, bringing in folks who have different perspectives to share these perspectives, but to consciously either roll back or roll back policies that perpetuate these proportionalities, and to hold others around us accountable. You're all in spaces where each other is not, like we're all in spaces where other folks are not. And what you do in that moment, you know, when I correct my friend or colleague, you know, that has a longer term impact, because the reason people feel comfortable breaking the law or feel comfortable, you know, breaking their ethics is because the people around us don't hold us accountable. That officer sat on George Floyd's neck with the type of confidence that leads me to believe he's done this before, but he probably didn't videotape it. And he was looking at the camera saying, I dare you, your video doesn't matter. And there was such a confidence in that, you know? And I tell you, and this is why I'm gonna get really real, right? You know, 13 years in prison, 9 different prisons across New York State. I've sat across people with that same confidence, you know? And then I've also, like have conversations with folks who have committed harm, who felt that the harm was okay because folks around them would not hold them accountable, or feel justified, you know, in the work that they're doing. So the idea that we give police officers this burden of, you're supposed to protect us and protect our communities and we can't do nothing without you, empowers them in such a way, which now we're coming to terms, at least some of society is coming to terms, that has been highly like toxic, you know? So hence the reason why, you know, you have communities that are not for police cameras and de-escalation. They're like, hey, we tried that and it just doesn't work, and we're just gonna get rid of the whole thing. And they'll tell you the problem with policing, it's policing.
State's Attorney, I'm going to ask you to jump in on that, but I want to incorporate a question from the audience. I'm so heartened to see that there are a lot of young prosecutors who are in the remote room right now, and I know how much folks are struggling with this. And one talks about how much resistance there is internally in her office to talking about these things. And she says, statements like some DA's offices are prejudiced but not ours, or some cops are bad but not all, they sort of miss the point of acknowledging the systemic issues we've been talking about. How do you acknowledge the truth of the system without it being a slight on people's personal character or professionalism? How can we address that kind of denial amongst prosecutors? What do you want to say to the young prosecutors out there?
Yeah, and listen, I've had to speak to my prosecutors in the wake of all of this, and I'm honest. Again, having the professor on this call, there have been moments in the last 3 weeks where am I making a difference? Can I do this? Am I part of it? And I've spoken to some of my assistants who've come to me and have felt for a long time, you know, one assistant said to me, I don't even want to get out the car. I've seen things. I've seen things that I've absorbed that is just part of the culture, that is the thing, but I've absorbed this and I keep showing up and doing this, and I feel like I am complicit in this. And then I've had others who have said to me, you say these things, you know, state's attorney, about racism. I'm not racist. And I think we've been so dainty around talking about race in real ways, especially in institutions that have long-standing systemic racist issues, afraid to offend. I remember being at IAP 3 years ago, where the issue of white supremacy came up. And my colleagues who I expect and admire, it was such a thing. Someone's, don't use that phrase. I am not a white supremacist. And it was trying to break down what it meant, that if we let our defenses down, to say that I know that you are probably a good person. You are a good person. You come for this with the right reasons. But there is no color blindness in this. There is no, like, I just get what I have. I don't see any, you know, I know there was a push at some point to, like, you can't tell the race of the person on a sheet of paper. And it's like, you think that's going to fix this? Do you think we got here by like a blindness of the system in the first place? There was intentionality around it. And so what I tell the young people who work for me, it is in our office. It is in my office as the first Black woman who holds this seat, who holds these values, who have 800 people who work for me. And I know that there are those who like don't want to hear or know this or believe that I'm off and are doing things in my name. I know our office is doing that. I know it, and it hurts. It is, but, and so because I know it, I have to be as fiercely intentional about teaching around it, however difficult and hard it may be, because you don't fix it if you don't. And so for the young prosecutors, I say, find someone to share your concerns with, to talk about these issues with. But I think we owe it as elected officials in these roles. I'm not going to be here forever, and the laws need to change, but we do a disservice. And I think I could have and should have done even more faster in these roles. It's tough when you're the first Black in these roles, in a system, in a profession. 95% of elected prosecutors are white. About 1% of them are women of color. Almost 90% of my jail is Black and brown. And I live in a city with racial tensions that go back a long time. And so there's a tepidness we sometimes have in, like, how do we broach this? How do you not be the angry Black woman? How are you not the woman that's always talking about race? And what I realize is that we can't afford to play those games. Those are games of the system being designed that way to keep you out so that you won't say that. What I would say to my colleagues that are in this, who are not of the minority, who are not in the minority, you also have that obligation. You also have that obligation. And to, just because you have a book club and say, let's read James's book or let's read White Fragility, which is great, and so I've done this, and do nothing about transparency and intentionality around your policies, book clubs and discussion groups mean absolutely nothing if your policies are policies that still have a racist impact.
Thank you. I'm going to ask everyone to just share some concluding thoughts before we close out, but I think that I would be really remiss if I didn't ask State's Attorney to address this question that really could be the subject of a much larger panel, but about the very specific kind of white supremacy that you experience as a woman of color prosecutor. You have, in fact, walked past neo-Nazis on your way into work, and you're not alone in that. amongst your colleagues who are in leadership positions. Can you speak to that, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, it is, I think, when we get into these roles, there is a lot of celebration when we break certain barriers and people are like, oh my gosh, you're the first. That also is so disruptive to the way the system has worked, that your mere presence will cause a certain element to want to rise up and try to get things back the way they were, right? It is what it is. And so my disagreements with the FOP, it would be one thing if it were just we disagreed on policy. It was another thing when they showed up to march on my office with 4 white supremacist groups. It would be another thing if you didn't like a decision on a case, but you didn't send me hate mail with images and language. And so I think what I've found in talking to other women of color in particular, there's a particular kind of hate that has been perpetrated on Black women prosecutors, particularly Black women prosecutors who have talked about these issues. And we have been silenced. I mean, I will tell you, I'm so excited about this moment. I'm weary, I'm exhausted. This has been traumatizing, if I'm being honest, to the degree that there's a man kneeling on another man's neck with his hand in his pocket, to also relive the trauma of having some of these same groups engage in such racist, misogynistic behavior to me, unchecked. And if they would do it to me, what are they doing to my sisters in the neighborhood? What are they doing to the woman who makes the call? And so I'm exhausted, and at the same time, in the wake of all of this, feeling a broader sense of liberation myself on this Juneteenth of, you're not gonna silence me by making me afraid to bring up race because it's uncomfortable to you. Because the system says you all are always talking about race. Well, thank God, yes, we are. But it has been vicious. It has been a deliberate attempt to keep voices and experiences, not just as a Black woman who comes from public housing, who's had people who've been in prison, who herself has been a victim, keeping us out. If you think about it, most of the people who do this work, who set these policies, are so disconnected from the communities that they serve, that the fact that that is the first person of color that they have met in their life, and yet are making decisions about that person's freedom. What would happen if we had more people who had those experiences in these roles and could see, but not have to be convinced of our humanity, not have to make arguments about why we should do things better. You can't go back home to your dinner table and justify your actions to the people who are impacted. What if we have more people like me in these roles? And so that requires me to speak up. But that requires also, for those of us who are in these roles who don't have those experiences, to pass the mic, to amplify those stories, and to be very intentional about these issues, particularly as it relates to race.
Thank you for that, and for all that you withstand in your service. I'd like to ask each one of you, bearing in mind the topic of this panel, racial justice and prosecution in America, to just offer a brief concluding thought. Professor Forman, President Mason, State's Attorney Foxx, and then Mr. Perez.
Thank you. I guess my quick concluding thoughts would be, first of all, if there's anybody out there listening who is been part of a march or part of a protest or part of raising these issues within your organization or in your office, please keep it up. The only reason that we are having this conversation is because of what you've been doing. And we had a moment right now where we're either going to become a footnote in history, or people are going to look back at this time in the way that we now look back at Rosa Parks or the sit-in movement in Greensboro, North Carolina, the beginning of a movement. And I think there's a possibility that we're at the beginning of a movement, but it's only going to be if folks keep at it. That's the first thing that I would say. And the second thing that I would say is that if you're somebody who's been doing this work for a while, if you're of my generation, if you've had ideas for 10, 15, 20 years about what to do, now's a good time to stop talking. I know it's odd to say this on a panel since we've been talking, but to stop talking and listening, and listen. Because the truth is, some of the things that we have been trying have not worked. They have not made a difference. And so what I would say to you is, if anybody comes to you peddling the same thing that they've been saying for 20 years, unchanged, unaffected by the conversation of the last years, months and years, then I'm going to have some real questions about the validity of what they're saying. So it's time to listen. And the last thing that I will say is that all of us, and this is, Ms. Foxx made this point when she talked about how everybody wants to blame somebody else. And it's easy in the system to look at another actor and say, well, it's your responsibility. And that's true in our society generally. And so what I would say is no matter what job you're in, if you're in a prosecutor's office, you're in a police department, if you're in finance, if you're in lending, if you're in whatever, if you're in academia, now is the time to ask hard questions within your organization that take the following form. Based on the renewed attention and exposure that many of us have come to systemic injustice and systemic racism in this society, what can we, and my organization do in response? What are new initiatives that we can pursue? And what are things that we have been doing that we can and should and must stop doing? So it's what should we start doing and what should we stop doing? And I suggest that if every organization, if every workplace, if every church, if every place where people come together, virtually or otherwise, were to ask that question, and this means white allies stepping up and leading, because the Black people in your community have been raising this and folks haven't been listening. So stepping up, raising your voice, sharing your ideas, being vulnerable, taking risks. If we all do that, we will begin to start to see change in every aspect of American society. And that's where fundamentally we need it, because we're talking about the criminal system right now. But we know we have a whole bunch of institutions that feed into the criminal system, and we have an obligation to change and transform and reimagine all of them to become anti-racist institutions.
It's hard not to say anything but amen to that. After that, I think that he covered everything. Thank you. This is a conversation, but we've got to move beyond the conversation. We've got to join the young people and be impatient and make change happen wherever we are. And again, and not looking at it as just a criminal justice issue. It's a societal issue. It's an issue across our communities. And now, whether you're a prosecutor, it's important to be an active member of your community and be civically engaged, because you're not going to change these things just in your prosecutor's office, just at Yale Law School, just at John Jay. I've got to be sitting down with the folks who make decisions about these policies. Somebody asked in the chat, in the Q&A, if I was saying that we didn't need legal changes as well. We need change in every facet, in every component. And we need to seize this moment and really not just talk about it, but actually really do something.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think that they've summed it up. It is a real special time, I absolutely believe, because this did start with, a real horrifying set of events, whether it was watching Ahmaud Arbery or hearing about Breonna Taylor or watching what happened to George Floyd, that sparked this deeper, those were police, and not even if Ahmaud Arbery wasn't police, but it was the brutality around the taking of Black lives and the deaths that occurred. But we are talking about systemic things, right? It would be easy just a few years ago to make it just about this issue. But the fact that we're talking about the tentacles that led to this issue, that we're talking about systemic racism across the board, and whether it is for some as superficial as who's on your syrup bottle, to the fact that we have people who are, corporations who are saying with their mouths and some with their pocketbooks and giving Juneteenth a holiday. This has been 24 days. 24 days. that we're talking not just about, it would be easy to just say, yes, we don't like police officers killing unarmed Black people. But the conversation has been, by the way, I see you, bank, that's saying that you support Black lives. Where are your lending practices to Black people? I see you, NFL, saying that you support this, but what are we going to do about Colin Kaepernick? This has had all the tentacles. And so I just would reinforce what was already said, is that there is a lane for everyone and an onus on everyone. This is not a if only they. Self-reflection in this moment will require you to step up and do more. That this is truly an all hands on deck. Now, for those who go out and march with your mask, because we are still in the middle of a global pandemic, and I will say too, that this has highlighted that the fact that we have more Black people dying of COVID, and then we recognize it was because of systemic failures and racism in our healthcare system, which is tied to our economic system, which all of this has made us really attuned and intentional, means that all of us have a collective responsibility to do this. So there's a panel about the justice system, but the professor is right. This is all of it. And this is really the time, if you've seen these small gains right now, and I shouldn't even say small, if you see what's happened in the last 24 days, it meant it was always possible. It meant it was all, Uncle Ben has been Uncle Ben for like forever. Aunt Jemima has been Aunt Jemima forever. It has always been possible. You have always had the power. Do not cede that power right now. Do not cede it in any aspect of this fight.
I tell you, this is definitely the best conversation I know is for a while, and maybe made my afternoon. I'm literally echoing everything that everyone said. Around, I think we have to force ourselves to be uncomfortable. And one thing that I know about change, and especially my journey, is that if you do the uncomfortable long enough, the uncomfortable becomes comfortable, and that works both ways. But what that means is that there are going to be decisions that need to be made that people are not going to feel comfortable, and we're going to be scared to death to make it, but need to be made. And the momentary pain of that momentary decision will pale in comparison to the long-term benefits. And there's, echoing, State Attorney Foxx, it's like, okay, great, you changed Aunt Jemima, and honestly, I asked my wife, throw away the box, but keep the pancake mix because we still have to eat pancakes. But like those superficial changes, what we really want to see is Black leadership in these positions, in these roles. And I'm known for not always being happy about, the nonprofit world, although that is the space that I work in. But many nonprofits are led by white, leaders, while the advocates, middle level management, or even like the folks actually doing the work are all people of color. And we've seen actually folks get hit during COVID-19 in different ways, where people who were actually doing the work were actually unemployed, house insecure, like a bunch of other things, where people at the higher levels were kind of joining the Zoom class, if you will. So it's more than just, hey, we're going to release a public statement, or we're going to change the face of this, although that's important. It's important for my son to look at TV and see himself, just as it's important for me to look at TV and not see myself shot every day. But true change and true power means when you look at a company or organization, you know what? We're going to hire our first Black prosecutor. We're going to hire our first Black anything across the board to really inform, the decisions that these companies make. And the reason they're missing the mark a lot of different times is because there is not a Black leadership within these organizations, meaningful Black leadership, not just add me to your board because my name looks good on there, but actual buy-in and empowerment to create space for these folks to lead at the highest levels of our country. We still have a Senate, we still have a Congress that's predominantly white. We still have a rich class that is predominantly white. The richest billionaires, the richest folks in this country are still predominantly white. Teachers in academia are predominantly white. Like all of these different institutions that really serve to socialize us, are predominantly white. And what I like to see is more people that look like me and talk like me inside of these spaces. And I'll say with my history, which is not the easy piece, right? To say, well, to see the value in a person's journey and to purposely not create a situation where we're holding people accountable to the standards of the past, especially if we know how that past kind of formulated itself, So I don't know, we can go on for days, but be uncomfortable, be comfortable with being uncomfortable, hold people around you, accountable. You're gonna lose friends doing it. You might even lose your job doing it if you really want to get real with it, And then lastly, give it time. We got here by 100 cuts or 1,000 cuts. I don't think that we're going to get out of this in 1,000 cuts. And I'm saying I'm an abolitionist. I do believe there's a society that we can create without prisons. But I'm also understand that it's not going to happen tomorrow. And the changes that we make in these moments will eventually get us there. And I'll probably get some flack after this call for saying that. But the beautiful thing about always speaking the truth and being principle-centered is that you don't have to worry about it. So in any case, I really appreciated this conversation and to everyone who still joined on with this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much to these visionary panelists and from the teams at the Institute for Innovation and Prosecution and at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. I want to wish a joyous Juneteenth to all of our listeners. The talk will be available on our website, prosecution.org, for sharing with others or for listening to again. And as we close, I'm really honored to invite our friend and colleague, Robbie Pollack of the PEN America Prison Writing Project and Carnegie Hall's Musical Connections to conclude our program. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you, Robbie.
The last time I sang this was on stage at Sing Sing Correctional Facility in New York with a friend of mine who recently came down with COVID inside, but he recovered. And it's like with that same hope, I want to offer it to all of you. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us, facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won, facing the rising sun of our new day begun. Let us march on till victory